Good morning. Make the transition from television back there to the commissioner up here. It's good to be with you in Tampa on a Monday morning in July. I think a few people like me have had travel experiences on Sunday and Monday, so appreciate the dedication of those of you who are here. If you keep track of SEC Football Media Days, this is our first time to hold our event in the Sunshine State and here in Tampa. But Tampa's become home to the Southeastern Conference for a number of events. Reminded staying here, back in 2009, I was actually in a job search for another commissioner's job, and my decision-making has proven to be wise, so I didn't jump at that chance. So that was 2009, our men's basketball tournament. 2022, we played our men's basketball tournament here as well. Our women's golf championship has found a home in Bel Air, Florida at Pelican Golf Club, and that's happened since 2024. The ReliaQuest Bowl is one of the longest standing relationships we have in the Southeastern Conference, and we added the Gasparilla Bowl to our postseason inventory just a few years ago. And we actually look forward as well to the College Football Playoff National Championship returning here to Tampa in 2029. All of that is a tribute to the work of the Tampa Bay Sports Commission, and it's their work that brings us here today, but also led to a decision that over the next 2 years, our Women's Gymnastics Championship will be held here in Tampa, both in March of 2027 and 2028. Last night, we started the week with a fan fest at Benchmark International Arena, which the Sports Commission helped facilitate, and their great work in planning, organizing, and supporting events is what made it appropriate for us to make the move here to Tampa this year. We also appreciate the staff of both the Tampa Marriott Water Street and the JW Marriott for their hospitality through the week. It's also worth my mentioning, one of our great relationships in the Southeastern Conference is with Regions Bank, one of our longest standing sponsors, and Paul Hodges and his team do great work supporting not only SEC Football Media Days, but the Southeastern Conference and the SEC Network throughout the year. I will note, break the first piece of news this morning, that next year SEC Football Media Days in 2027 will return to Nashville, Tennessee, and those dates will be July 12th through the 15th. Before I jump into the issues of the day, I think it's worth taking a moment to recognize what has been accomplished by the student athletes, our universities, our coaches, and our administrators during the preceding year, in part because the 2025-2026 academic year was going to be one of those years that serves as a defining chapter in the history of college athletics. Our institutions had to navigate historic level of change while continuing to provide outstanding educational and competitive opportunities for our student athletes. And that means that on the field, we experienced a conference record 13 team national championships. Our previous high was 10. We have 22 sports in which we sponsor championships, and over half of those right now are national champions. We place more teams than any other conference in the college football playoff. While we didn't achieve the ultimate destination of a national championship, the strength of this conference in football is clear. And when you go beyond football and look at postseason participation in NCAA championships throughout our sports inventory, it is typical that Southeastern Conference teams fill most or the highest number of teams represented in those brackets. Those accomplishments are extraordinary, and they're a representation of the commitment made by young people who choose to enroll in our universities, both to be educated and to fulfill their competitive expectations. The work of our coaches, the dedication of our athletics administrators, and the leadership at the president and chancellor and board level throughout our conference. That change that I referenced at a historic level included navigating implementation of the House settlement that a year ago was very much brand new. But we also continued to invest in the student-athlete experience, medical support, mental wellness care and initiatives, leadership development. Today we launch an even more extensive education program around sports wagering to try to help young people and our staff members avoid the pitfalls of what is becoming more culturally accepted around the area of sports gambling. As a league, we added over 1,200 new scholarships. Those are not football scholarships. Those were in sports other than football. Over 700 of those new full scholarship experiences are for women's student athletes. That's one of the positive changes from the House settlement that has been missed, the opportunity to increase scholarship numbers and provide full scholarships in sports, typically Olympic sports that used to be partial scholarship environments. That commitment continues to be reflected in a high level of interest in what happens around our competition. Southeastern Conference football remains the second most watched sports property in the United States, trailing only the National Football League. And we account for just over 40% of the live viewership hours consumed among the four major conferences. Our football programs draw an average of 80,000 fans per game. That's our average number. And this was the stat of my summer. That's the highest average attendance for any sport league in the world. And we're national leaders in attendance in just about every other sport sponsored by the Southeastern Conference. Across every measure, interest in our league continues to grow. And that's attached to the work of those leaders on our campuses whom I cited a moment ago. These and other achievements provide a solid foundation for our present and our future, but they're not our destination because we know that success brings with it responsibility. Our responsibility isn't simply to celebrate victories and championships. Our responsibility is to provide leadership. The leadership needed to preserve the values, the opportunities, and competitive integrity that have made college athletics so meaningful for so many generations. It's that responsibility and the decisions required to fulfill the responsibility that are my focus this morning. And one of our greatest responsibilities is to establish a stable national framework for college athletics. For more than 6 years, those of us in the conference office, the leaders on our university campuses, Southeastern Conference student athletes, and policymakers have worked in good faith seeking the return of national standards through federal legislation. These efforts have demonstrated not only how complex these issues have become, but also have reinforced my belief that congressional action remains a needed path to provide that long-term stability. At its core, it sounds like a straightforward objective. One national standard, a national framework with rules that can be consistently enforced, because student athletes, coaches, and universities deserve to compete under consistent standards regardless of geography. Over and over, our student athletes tell us the same thing. When they line up for kickoff, tip-off in a basketball game, first pitch in the spring, or when they put their feet in the starting blocks at a track meet, they want to know that every competitor from other teams, from different campuses across different states, that those competitors are being held to the same standards that apply to them. Among all the press releases, legislative drafts, committee hearings, and political commentary, that message from our student athletes, to me, is the clearest message we have heard. Hold everyone to the same standard. Now, the reality is, just turning on the news this morning, you're reminded that Congress and the federal government have no shortage of critical issues competing for their attention. And we appreciate the bipartisan work of members of the House and Senate and the interest from the President and his administration in working to address the future of college athletics. Through the fall, the winter, and into the spring, that bipartisan work produced a focus in the House of Representatives on the SCORE Act. And earlier this summer, Senators Ted Cruz and Maria Cantwell introduced the Protect College Sports Act. And I want to be clear that we appreciate the tremendous efforts that have gone into these legislative drafting initiatives. And we're engaged specifically now in ongoing dialogue around improving the Protect College Sports Act. I also want to note, because he's one of the senators in our footprint, the engagement and the work of Senator Schmidt from Missouri. You may not know Senator Schmidt, but he did make SportsCenter's top 10 plays with one of his catches during the congressional baseball game earlier this summer. That Senate bill contains many provisions that we support and we think are both healthy for college athletics and the participants in college athletics. And just quickly, that includes enhanced expectations for student-athlete health and safety, supporting educational opportunities, providing scholarship protections, overseeing agent activity, increasing the participation of our student-athletes in governance, which we as a conference have led in that area for years and actually decades, and those national standards of which I spoke, particularly in eligibility and transfers. We support the effort behind the Protect College Sports Act. However, we believe changes to the act are necessary to make it most effective. And the changes we've suggested are both achievable and reasonable, and we're committed to working with Congress to move the legislation across the finish line. There are 4 principles that we believe should guide this legislative effort at this time. The first is about those national standards, which must be enforceable. If Congress establishes national rules, individuals and organizations who comply with those rules should not be subject to litigation simply for following the law. Without meaningful legal protections, we risk the continuing cycle of uncertainty that has been part of our challenge in college athletics in recent years. Second, the framework should be truly national. The legislation moves us in the right direction, but it should more fully replace the growing patchwork of state laws that are conflicting and create competitive differences based upon state borders. Remember that quote from our student athletes. We just want to know that others are held to the same standards. Third, transparency and accountability are essential. Rules governing name, image, and likeness activity are only effective if they can be enforced. And that requires meaningful transparency so everyone operates under the same expectations and the same level of accountability. Without it, loopholes undermine that competitive fairness expectation. And then fourth and finally, the legislation should treat similarly situated organizations equally while preserving institutional choice. Whether discussing conference structure or media rights, federal law should establish fair and consistent standards, not different rules for different organizations, and should preserve the voluntary decision-making rather than mandating outcomes. The areas of concern that we've identified, and every time I write a memo on this, I find it posted soon on social media, so we offered 10 common sense suggestions that track on those 4 principles. Those 10 concepts are not SEC issues. Those are changes that we believe benefit all of college athletics in providing a national solution. Our recommendations are intended to help Congress achieve what our student athletes, our universities, and our fans desire, that one national framework with meaningful protections for student athletes, enforceable rules, fair competition, and providing long-term stability. If Congress is going to act, and again, I believe it should for the reasons identified, we have one opportunity to get this legislation right. If Congress passes a bill and it's signed into law, we won't be returning to D.C. in a year or two asking and receiving help to correct the gaps that exist. That's why it's important that these common sense areas be addressed now before the bill becomes law. But for us, federal legislation is only one part of our responsibility. The same principles that we talk about guiding congressional decision-making should also guide us every day. Over the past year, there's been considerable discussion about the format of the college football playoff. In fact, if I'm honest, I'd suggest that since the college football playoff was created, there's been considerable discussion about the future format of the college football playoff. That helps you fill space, right? Those conversations are important, but our approach has remained consistent. We're not necessarily interested in finding the easiest path. We are focused on finding the right path for college football. Leadership sometimes is not about having an immediate answer. Leadership is about asking the right questions before making decisions that shape our future. And some decisions are so important that taking the time needed to let the important questions be answered is the right step. And the need to have the right information should properly inform our decisions. And some of those important questions that remain for us is, how do we preserve and build the value of the regular season? That is a judgment-based answer that we continue to consider and research. We also need to know, what is the actual interest from fans and from media entities in an expanded college football playoff? How do we respect the academic calendar and respect the well-being of our student athletes? When we went from 4 to 12, those questions were answered during the consideration process. How do we create a postseason that rewards excellence while strengthening the long-term future of the sport and providing postseason competitive opportunities that are meaningful? And I'm certain to be asked, the last one, what happens to conference championship games in the sport of football if the playoff expands further? Those questions and others rightfully do and should guide our conversations, and each deserves thoughtful answers, not assumptions and not incomplete information. But we do need to bring this conversation to conclusion in short order so we can move on and focus on the future of the game. This same principle-based decision-making helped guide the Southeastern Conference when considering a 9-game football schedule which begins this season. Now we, and I recognize that a 9-game Southeastern Conference football schedule, coupled with our expectation that we maintain a high-quality non-conference opponent, creates one of the most, in fact, I'm going to scratch what I wrote, it creates, without question, the most demanding sets of football schedules in all of college football. But these decisions were made after years of thoughtful discussion, careful analysis, and spirited debate, which led us to the conclusion that the 9-game schedule was appropriate. And the 9-game schedule reflects confidence in our universities, our student athletes, and in our football programs. It preserves great rivalries, historic rivalries, many of which are played every year. It creates more compelling conference matchups and reinforces our long-standing commitment to competitive excellence. When you look at our schedule, no one has created the kind of weekly competition that exists in the Southeastern Conference. It's competition that our fans will experience every week because we believe we're the best conference in college football. And if so, we should also embrace the challenges with a difficult and challenging conference schedule, the best schedule in college football. It will challenge our teams, it will prepare them for the highest level of competition, and reflects who we are as a conference. So whether we discuss legislation, the future of the college football playoff, the future of SEC football, our responsibility is not to simply chase the next headline or simply react to the issue of the day. Our responsibility is to make principled decisions that strengthen college football, preserve what makes it special, and position it for long-term success. Because in just a few weeks, all across our 12-state footprint, the stadiums of the Southeastern Conference will come alive again. Families will gather. Tailgates will happen. Campuses will fill. Rivalries will be renewed. New leaders will emerge. New champions will be crowned. And we're at that time when every season begins with a thought of hope and possibility. And our responsibility is to preserve everything that makes those moments possible. Before I conclude and we turn to questions, I do want to take a moment because we're reminded as things happen rapidly in our lives that as the years go on, we lose some people who are special to us. And we experience that with members of the media who would normally be with us today, but we lost during the past year. Wes Rucker first was a Knoxville sports journalist who provided extensive coverage of the University of Tennessee athletics for over 2 decades. Joey Knight was here in Tampa, a longtime sports writer for the Tampa Bay Times and the Tampa Tribune. He covered the Tampa Bay area sports scene for over 3 decades, and we lost both Wes and Joey back in February. We also lost Philip Marshall. Philip covered the SEC, mostly Auburn's athletic program, for more than half a century. In fact, Philip goes back to the days of the SEC Skywriters Tour, the predecessor of SEC Media Days, back as early as 1977. Respect the work you do. Sometimes it's tough, but we mourn the losses of your colleagues. And I want to say thank you to each of you, no matter what questions you might ask, for joining us over the next few days. I want to say thank you to the SEC staff, who kind of go from event to event and never losing the focus on the importance of supporting outstanding experiences. We are here as staff to make your media days successful, and please call upon any of us if we might help you do better in engaging in your work. And with that, as is our tradition, I'm going to turn to Kevin, who moderate questions, but I will note that this is also the reminder that Bob Holt used to be quick right up here with that first question, another reminder of someone special to us all. So Kevin, take it away.
Thank you, Commissioner. If you have a question, raise your hand. We have Tommy, Jalen, and Kaylin with microphones. We'll bring a microphone up, so go ahead and come on up, Kaylin. Again, please stand and give your name and affiliation. We'll start over to your right-hand side. Commissioner.
Hi, Greg. It's Eddie Pels with AP. How real are the conversations within the SEC about potentially breaking away from the college structure as we know it? And in any way, is that being used as leverage in the conversations you're having with Congress about the bill?
So you phrased the question of how real. So I'll take that as like real or not real. So they're real. People have talked about that. They've opined about the frustrations that bring them to the point of saying we should look at something significantly different. I do not believe that is a leverage point. I think that's just honest communication. I would prefer that stay in a meeting room or on a video conference and not be part of the D1 ticker the next morning, but I don't control all of that. Eddie, what I think is important is those comments represent a high level of frustration with the circumstance in which we find ourselves. We have regulated ourselves more aggressively than other colleagues by choice across our league. We've had different academic eligibility restrictions in the past. So we've had different transfer restrictions in the past. So some of what you hear comes out of a culture that we can regulate ourselves. But the frustration that exists is when you go to a meeting 8 years ago and we want to change the volunteer coach rule in a Division I setting, and the Division I membership can't see their way through change, and so that creates risk. I think some of the transition into this 5-year eligibility model, that it happened when it did and the way it did, that magnifies frustration. We went through a college football playoff discussion for years and introduced a 12-team playoff where it just sat because colleagues couldn't move. And they had reasons, but those reasons really didn't resonate. And so understand that beneath the observation is frustration. But I also know the pride with which I spoke of 13 national championships, and there is meaning and value, and I do think a national expectation that we participate in a national organization. But that national organization must function in a healthy manner. Otherwise, that simmering will continue.
Okay, we'll go down in front of me, third row. Kirk.
Kurt Bowles from the Houston Chronicle, Greg. Speaking about the ninth game, what's your degree of confidence, if any, that the selection committee will consider that metric very heavily? And how much do you feel like your head coaches are embracing that challenge?
Well, they're here. So the fact that our head coaches are here tells me they're embracing the challenge. I'm actually one who believes competitors want great challenges. And I'm unapologetic about that reality. As it relates to the College Football Playoff Selection Committee, we have heard about strength of schedule, strength of record. I think there were some references for strength of conference. We had what I'll call an unsatisfactory conversation with members of the College Football Playoff staff and some of their advisors in Destin. That's rehashing from a couple months ago. That's not a secret. And that's a reminder of that process needing to continually improve. So my confidence is that people will act with integrity. I do think we have questions about the understanding of the strength and rigor associated with competing in the Southeastern Conference.
Commissioner, we'll go over on our far right-hand side alongside the wall.
Hey, Commissioner, Steve Moulton, 97.7 ESPN The Zone. One of the key words coming out of the spring meetings was transparency. You referenced it in your opening statement. Has there been a thought or a conversation about inside the conference, school to school, that the conference be more transparent so at least they know what is going on inside?
So from a transparency standpoint, Eddie asked me a question that was a conversation that wasn't meant to be transparent, so I think natural transparency seems to be taking place, but I'm not certain if I know what particular topic. Not everything that we discuss is simply going to be published, and in fact there are reasons for confidentiality. You have the freedom to ask me anything this morning, so I'll be as transparent as I can be in this moment. How's that for an answer?
Okay, we're going to go here on our left-hand side. Coming
I do
right
get to
behind you.
decide what I answer, though. So,
Go here.
Commissioner Mike Griffith from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. You've obviously done your due diligence on the 16-team playoff model. What are some of the hurdles or some of the things that you need to be informed on to consider the 24-team playoff model?
I went through that list in the midst of my remarks, so I won't rehash most of those. We don't have any idea at this point of the clear media interest in an expanded playoff. We do have an understanding of what happened when we went to 12, and we considered other formats. So that's one. Second is the calendar is challenging. There is a line embedded in the current version of the Protect College Sports Act that the football season be fully completed by January 8th. If you think through the implications of particularly that date, remember the American Football Coaches Association introduced that idea, produced a frustrated phone call from me to Craig Bowl about the lack of consultation. But you have to find places to play the games. And you have to think about whether overlap of those games when they're played is acceptable or not. I tend to think the access point is important for young people. And as we've had conversations in smaller groups, they can answer, I'd rather have a chance than not have a chance. But there are limits on the number of games that you can play over time. So answering that first smaller set of, the first set of points in my remarks is fully on my mind. That smaller set of points hopefully filters it a bit more.
Commissioner will go in the section in front of me about 3/4 of the way back.
Yeah, Jason Caldwell, 24/7 Sports. Transparency's been a term thrown around this morning, and accountability too. Where does that fit in with officiating, with the calls, the questionable calls that have happened the last couple of years? Is there any plans to create more transparency for calls either during or after games to provide some clarification?
Every week, officials go on a football field, a basketball court, softball field, baseball field, and everything they do is transparent. Everything they do is transparent. You can't hide if you put on an officiating uniform. We've added, in fact, we've been the innovators in replay with the motivation to get it right. That provides transparency as well. In fact, we're the conference that implemented at the collegiate level in our tournament the automated balls and strikes format. Can't be any more transparent than that reality, and we've pushed that to seek the opportunity to allow that in the regular season. We'll continue to do that. There are limits to transparency. When an error is made in a game, scholarships are not pulled for a player for one incident. They don't lose their starting job. And so every week we provide feedback to officials. We don't publish that. I also have a great deal of respect for people that are willing to put themselves in the venues of the Southeastern Conference to conduct that activity. And I think we have found a reasonable balance. Reasonable people can disagree with that. But the elements and the steps, the elements that we've added and the steps we've taken to try to get it right are evidence of our motivation and our willingness, quite candidly, to be transparent.
We'll stay in the center aisle over to our right-hand side on the aisle.
Yeah, Greg, Barry Trammell with the Tulsa World. You mentioned the conference championship game. It appears all your colleagues are ready to just lop their championship game pretty easily. Clearly, the SEC is not, but how much can you hang on to that championship game format if every other conference is willing to cast it aside?
I'd have to go back and figure out the number of years we did it on our own when conference championship games were initiated. So making our own decision, that I was going to guess 4. That's okay. And in fact, the majority didn't flip in our direction for probably about a decade. I think even the move to 12 has created pressure around championship games. And we've talked through the factors that support the pro list, and we've talked about some of the con list, if you will, the negatives that need to be considered. And we have some time. We will have a conference championship game the first Saturday in December of 2026. We have contracts and plans in place well beyond that, but we have time for consideration. And one of the factors for us is what will happen with that college football playoff.
Commissioner, we'll go over here on the left, front row.
Morning, Commissioner. Michael Gittins, War Report, Auburn. You said that everything that the officials do is transparent, but what feedback have you gotten from your coaches and your presidents about the officiating processes? Do they feel like it's going well and that it's transparent? Are they receiving the information that they're asking for after the games? Can you explain that process?
Absolutely. Our coaches have the opportunity to submit plays for review. That information is evaluated and communicated back to our campuses. The expectation is that information, the back and forth, be communicated in a confidential manner. So that is not transparent. I'm being transparent about that, by the way. That's the deal. When I talked about transparency, there are no editors in officiating unless you consider replay to be editors. And so you're in real time between 12 and 48 cameras in football evaluating your performance. And is everyone happy all the time? No. But I saw that yesterday during the World Cup. I saw it last week and the week before during the World Cup. I saw it during the NBA playoffs. I've watched it with ABS in Major League Baseball. We have humans making instant decisions in a dynamic situation. And I think our officials do a remarkably effective job at managing those situations and those decisions. Imperfect though it may be.
Commissioner, we'll go over to the right-hand side on the far aisle.
Jacob Worthen, KRUI Radio. With the college football playoff, revenue sharing, and conference expansion all changing the sport at once, what issue will most define the SEC over the next 5 years?
The leadership of which I spoke moments ago, our ability to be both influential and effective through change. I'd like to win every championship. When I interviewed for this job in 2015, that was actually one of the three components. First was graduate every student athlete. Second was win every championship. 13 of 22 is pretty good. And change the world, which is about influence. And I want us to continue to use that influence, as I've described, to support not just the long-term health of college football during a time of change, but also all of college athletics, all 22 of our championship sports. History is a really educational and informative element at this point. We're dealing with things that have persisted for a century. You go back and read the history of college athletics in the early 1900s through the 1910s, 20s, and 30s. And we're managing even that list you provided. What's the postseason look like? What are the health and safety issues? What happens around gambling? What happens around educational structure? What about student-athlete support? I think we do a better job now than has ever been done in college athletics, but we haven't achieved that level of stability as we go through change that's needed at this point.
Okay, we'll go over back to our left, Andrea.
Andrea Adelson with ESPN. Greg, you've mentioned the suggested changes you've put forward to Cruz and Cantwell. Does the bill have to incorporate all the changes you've asked for the SEC to support it? And if not, are there like 2 or 3 that could be implemented and maybe some others not that the SEC would support?
In my view, that's part of the conversation, that engagement that I've described. Do you have to bat 1,000? You never give up things in those conversations. What we've tried to do, Andrea, is identify those items that, when you get to Title II, so the quick primer of the legislation is Title I is kind of about the operational administrative issues, and Title II is this notion of super leagues and media right combination. In Title I, there are 7 that we identified. I think they're all worth consideration and inclusion. Whether we achieve that or not remains to be seen. But I so appreciate the engagement of Senators Cantwell and Cruz and their staffs in the conversation and others that are participating. In Title II, when I first read it, it's like, well, why is that even in there? And I understand I've commented on this in real time in Destin. There are interests that have introduced those issues. We really have 3 or 4 changes there, if Title II remains, that are critically important to us. So not everything's necessarily the same, but I think every element that we've introduced is worthy of conversation. And I appreciate the engagement of the senators in taking it so seriously.
Time for a couple more. We'll go over here to our right-hand side on the aisle.
Franz Beard from Gator Bait. With all the lawsuits that are going on right now regarding the 5th year of eligibility, is there a plan B to perhaps just go ahead and grandfather these people in, or will the fights continue in court?
I don't control that decision-making. Our input was that the NCAA not proceed on the timeline that it chose to introduce and the membership voted to pursue. I think there was more information and research that was needed. And my observation comes from someone who back in the 90s, when I was in the Southland Conference office, staff wrote a resolution about looking at 5 seasons of eligibility. We, and this gets back to Eddie's question a bit, we identify NCAA eligibility standards as those that establish eligibility in our league. When you go through these moments, that's why the frustration that Eddie asked about exists in part. Not all of it, but it informs that frustration. You're going to ask Charlie Baker and his legal team how they intend to defend those lawsuits and whether they'll make a pivot.
We'll take one final question here on the second row. George.
Good morning, Commissioner. George Somerville from the Touchdown. You talked about responsibilities earlier. It made me think that your role was as much about a custodian of college football. Do you have real concerns about the direction of travel of collegiate athletics? And is the proposed legislation the answer, and does it go far enough?
So, George, in your Scottish brogue, I want to make sure that I track on each of the elements. One is about travel, correct? So thank you for traveling across the pond to be here in Tampa. Presumably the weather in Scotland and Tampa are 2 different things. When we've made decisions, we can only represent the decisions we've made. We have looked at travel, and whether that's the expansion in the early 90s, the early 2010s, or the most recent expansion, our longest journey when we were at 14 was Columbia, South Carolina to College Station, Texas, and now it's Columbia, South Carolina to Austin, Texas, which is 5 or 10 minutes on an airplane. So we have continued to think about travel. In fact, I think one of the advantages present for Southeastern Conference members, for coaches, and for our student athletes is you're not spending hours and hours and hours journeying cross-country across 4 time zones to compete in your league. It's Eastern and Central Time in 2 hours or less. So that's my answer to the travel piece. Is the legislation really what you're asking, what I would have drafted had I been given the pen solely? No, but that's part of the legislative process, the back and forth. Our feedback, the feedback that I identified, the common sense issues we've identified are an indication that we think there need to be adjustments made. And then the issue of custodianship. So usually the way that question is asked of me, it is asked, well, you're the commissioner of the SEC, and that's all you think about. And the SEC keeps me up at night. And it's why I have less hair and grayer hair than I had when I stood in this podium in Birmingham in 2015. But I've said over and over, there are situations and circumstances and decisions where maybe that's not what the Southeastern Conference membership wanted initially, but we worked through our thinking because it was better for all of college sports. We pushed for a move away from equivalency scholarships previously. Those 1,200 full scholarships I talked about, yep, it costs some money, but that's good for college athletes. That's good for our Olympic athletes. The volunteer coach legislation we introduced, $300+ million settlement later, turns out that would have been a good idea for college athletics. I fully understand the responsibility that comes with this role. I didn't understand it when I was commissioner of the Southland Conference in Division I, even though I had responsibility beyond the borders of my league. And I hope to be both, using the words I used earlier, influential and effective. Yes, unapologetically for the Southeastern Conference, but with the recognition that national competition, the ability to hold a national championship trophy up, compete against colleagues from different states in an equitable fashion, and achieve the mountaintop of a national championship, that has meaning. And we're challenged now to keep our focus on that reality. That's about, in part, being a custodian, and that is a responsibility I recognize.
Commissioner Sankey, thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you, Kevin. Again, thanks. Ask our staff if we can be of help. I'll probably see you in the hallway, and I'll run away rapidly from your questions, but I know I'll have the opportunity to interact with a number of you through the week. So we'll be back shortly with the start of our coaches rotation.